So, yes, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining tonight. As Brian said, this is session 1 of 3, which we are doing as a bit of a kind of focus and a spotlight for rural and island community councils. And tonight's session will be specifically focusing on local place plans. And tonight's session will be largely delivered by myself. I'm a director at a social enterprise called ImagineIf.space, and I should be joined later on by my colleague Paul Eade, who has an enterprise called Place at the Table. Just a little bit about us before we get started. So some of the services that we offer include local place plan consultancy, so whether that be mentoring, writing draft plans, coding data, everything to community engagement, facilitation, also training delivery, particularly around climate workshops as well as project management. And then each of us offers some additional expertise. So ourselves at ImagineIf, we do quite a lot of co-housing briefs and also just development briefs in general. And also Place at the Table can provide planning advice and briefs again, as well as mediation. And also just to cover a couple of kind of prerequisites to coming to this training tonight. Hopefully you've managed to catch some of the free to access 6 sessions that we ran earlier this year. Don't worry too much if you haven't been able to do that, but we would invite you to go back to that because we're not going to have time to cover all of the basics that were covered in those sessions. But please do feel free to pop any questions in the chat that you have, as there'll be plenty of time for some questions and answers in today's training session. So yeah, what questions might you already have? We're just inviting you, I guess, in the joining instructions to come with in questions that you might currently be living with. So maybe if you could take this opportunity just to pop some of those questions that you're coming to this session with in the chat, and that will allow us later on in the sort of Q&A to begin to work through some of those. So whether that's questions you've already got or that come through as the training is ongoing, please do pop them in the chat. As I say, we've got time built into the session to discuss and share thoughts and insights collectively. The way we are hoping to host tonight is it's very much a kind of peer learning exchange, as well as Paul and I being able to offer insights that we've had through working with community councils and other community organisations across Scotland and rural Scotland, I should say, and on their local place plans. So yeah, who's in the room? From the sign up, these were some of the community councils that were signed up. Okay, so just a little bit of context setting as well when we're talking about local place plans, really thinking about how they might relate to these bigger processes known as local development plans, which are covered by local authorities in terms of their kind of regional spatial planning. And what we've tried to do is just dig into some of those kind of respective and linked deadlines, I guess, in relation to like calls for local place plans, but also where those local development plans are sitting in terms of their process. So I'm not going to go into like huge amounts of detail here, but as you can see on the screen, the original deadlines have been somewhat extended, I think, pretty much in every situation by almost 12 months. And what we mean by that is when local place plans kind of came in, but as part of the local development plan legislation, they have to put out a call for local place plans, and they set essentially a deadline for when they are to be returned to be taken into account as part of the kind of policy development process. And that does vary across local authorities is what we're seeing. But I think it's also worth being mindful of that everyone is in this boat for the first time. So there's lots of kind of learnings being going on in terms of, you know, when the kind of final deadline, so to speak, is, and when actually the reality of, you know, how a local place plan can inform the local development plan actually translates. So we try and refer to it sometimes as a bit of a sort of egg timer. So when a local authority sets their deadline, we try and say that yes, that is a deadline to work to, but also that A, that might be delayed, but also B, there is also more chance for local place plans beyond that stage to still be taken into account, albeit that window kind of shortens. So it is good to try and think about adhering to those deadlines, albeit they are shifting. And really, when we talk about that, that's really about how local place plans can actually then shape and inform the policy development section of the local development plan. But it also is worth noting as well that local place plans can be accepted at any time in terms of being material considerations for planning applications as well. But just coming back to maybe some questions being faced by rural and island communities, I think some of those were already just beginning to be teased out, I guess, just in those introductions today. But some of the ones that we've certainly observed or had come to us quite a lot when working in these areas is how do we best express our diverse housing needs? How might we be able to express proposals relating to our coasts and maritime areas? How can we use planning policy to support rural and island communities facing depopulation and climate impacts? And also, we've got a huge geography to cover. Help, how do we even begin to do that? And as I say, it'd be great to just hear some of the questions that you might have arrived with tonight. So again, please just pop those in the chat so we can kind of begin to build up a bit of a list for later on. So in terms of what we'll be covering today, we'll first just do a little brief recap of what a local place plan is and can achieve. We'll also then think about the main bulk of the session is going to be looking at kind of 4 key issues that we've kind of experienced as being like particularly prevalent in rural and island conditions. That's not to say it's exhaustive, but we thought these would be some helpful points to kind of consider tonight. So that's in relation to housing, coasts, depopulation and climate. And then, as I say, we'll have a good amount of time tonight to address your questions. So in the context of local place plans, in rural and island settings. And then we'll end tonight with just some final tips for producing your local place plans in these contexts as well. So what is a local place plan? As I say, there's some really good kind of overview videos of this that we did earlier this year, but we just wanted to provide a quick recap so that everyone's on the same page for tonight. So a local place plan is an expression of communities' aspirations which can influence local spatial planning policy. So that is to help communities to develop and deliver their own development projects, but also setting out priorities to regulate future development in an area. One thing that's also worth noting is these can also be hybrid documents with elements of community action plans woven in, covering all of these issues that your place kind of needs to thrive. So sometimes they're just purely about spatial conditions in relation to just being a local place plan, but in others examples, they merge with a community action plan. But just a reminder as to what that means. So just like an example hypothetical proposal. So in this slide, the context of developing a community garden. So for a community action plan project, the kind of things it would cover is who might be the lead organisation, what sort of timelines would it be, also who might you need to work in partnership with, and also typically some kind of key action points for kind of next steps. Whereas a local place plan proposal, on the other hand, is more about looking at allocating that land for inclusion within the next local development plan. So for example, if that site in the example isn't necessarily allocated for this use, it's looking to then align with national planning framework for policies to help us support that argument to say, right, local authority, we would like this land allocated for this use. And the policies, for example, might be policy 9 around brownfields. So if that site, for example, was vacant and derelict, and also around community wealth building, for example. And that just helps to think about securing allocation, sort of permission in principle, so to speak, for a change of use. And in this context, it was, say, from a former pub to a community garden. So that's a kind of example of saying kind of land and spatial allocation versus actually thinking about the sort of action plan elements, which is the kind of next steps and who delivers it. It's also worth remembering that a local place plan is an extra arrow in your quiver. So there's a statutory right to prepare. It's also helpful for de-risking development by communities as well. It can also offer suggestions for how developer contributions are spent to try and sort of influence or have more of an influence around developers' behaviours. But also for precision around kind of emerging regulatory policies, for example, locations for nature networks is one example. It can also be helpful as a starting point for transparent conversations with landowners and service providers about longer term aims. So really trying to, I guess, think about being able to, I kind of refer to it as make visible what is currently invisible in terms of what the community's aspirations are and having that mandate. And then that kind of links on to the next point around it being a kind of public record for your position to influence the local development plan, but also local place plans can also help to inform council service delivery more broadly. So whilst they are by and large, you know, a planning document, actually we're seeing how they can also be able to kind of leverage a community voice in terms of also shaping that service delivery. And also just as a sort of hopefully a kind of comfort, local place plans come in all shapes and sizes. So on the screen here, I've got a range of different examples from largely rural contexts. And if you kind of look up local place plan registers on any local authority web pages, you can download these in full and have a kind of flick through. So you've got everything from like highly designed documents that have had consultant input, right through to very kind of simple overmarked plans with some basic text. There is no prescriptive way that these have to be done, so I think it is useful to kind of look through a few and also kind of gauge and manage your own expectations looking at the resources you have. But again, we'll reflect on that a little bit later in the session. So onto some kind of key topics. As I say, there's going to be 4 that we're going to look at this evening. So we've got climate, depopulation, housing, and coasts. So to begin with climate, and I should say, just as we're going through these topics, the way we've tried to structure it is thinking about how you can consider these within a local place plan, but we've also tried to think about how can we support you to link those to the National Planning Framework 4 policies, and what that does is help you justify any proposal that goes into your plan. So when we take climate as an example, what are the things we're beginning to see? So when we've been working with communities, Paul's done some work over in some of the islands, and I've done some work in various rural areas in Scotland. And the list on the screen here is just some of the emerging themes that we've seen under climate, both mitigation and adaptation issues. And by mitigation, I mean cutting carbon emissions, and adaptation is thinking about how we can change our behaviours and places to adapt to that changing climate. So some of the things that we're seeing included within place plans, we've got coastal, river and surface flood risk, renewable energy projects such as wind turbine developments. Again, I think that was touched on in the introduction around the kind of implications of infrastructure around that, active travel routes and connections, retrofitting in conservation areas. So for example, looking at the policies around some of that, particular, as I say, in conservation areas and with listed buildings, for example, around installing double glazing or solar panels. Other things might be to do with nature networks and corridors, also linking to housing quality and infrastructure, as well as things like circular economy, so having dedicated spaces for reuse. So these are some of the sort of emerging proposals that we've seen come through some of the place plans that we've worked within. But as you can see, climate is such a cross-cutting topic. And I just thought it would be helpful as well tonight to just signpost to an additional resource which can really help begin to visualise what some of that could mean for your place. So just to signpost to the Adaptation Scotland Climate Ready Places resources. They cover lots of different kind of geographies and places and give you examples of an unadapted place and an adapting place. And that can be quite helpful at just kind of prompting thoughts around what might be relevant for your place, because a lot of them are to do with kind of spatial land or building use. And just to highlight kind of why this is important, there's also some additional guidance that's come with the National Planning Framework 4 guidance around mitigation and adaptation in particular. And really it's just saying that we need to be thinking of this stuff all together. So I really like this diagram from Highland Adapts because it begins to help synthesize all of the things we kind of need to be thinking about around climate action. And tonight we're not going to go into a deep dive just about climate, but I just wanted to signpost again to this as a helpful diagram for reference. But just in terms of a policy context, so policy one actually, right up front, which we're not going to talk about specifically tonight, but that is around addressing the climate emergency. And policy two really kind of complements that in terms of being a bit more specific about climate change mitigation and adaptation. So before we're going to go into like worked examples of how this has maybe been applied in a local place plan context next, but just in terms of a bit of a kind of zoom in on what does the policy say. So the policy says to encourage and promote and facilitate development that minimises emissions and adapts to the current and future impacts of climate change. So if we refer back a couple of slides, we're beginning to visualise what some of those changes might be, and also thinking about how do any proposals within your local place plan help to meet those policy outcomes. For example, making our places more resilient to climate change impacts. So on the right hand side, you can see an extract of some of the policy speak, and I've put in page numbers to what is a very long document, but hopefully with the Control F button and also these page references that will help kind of navigate that. But just around highlighting key points, I guess, to have a think about in any local place plan proposals. So thinking about, is your proposal minimising greenhouse gas emissions? Is it adapting to current and future risks of climate change? And also retrofitting measures that also support existing developments too, that reduce emissions and also support adaptation will be supported. So when we're beginning to think of ideas for our place plans, really thinking about that with a bit of a kind of climate lens on, is there a way that we can also use these proposals to make our communities more resilient at the same time? But that's all very dry and maybe quite difficult to understand. So what we thought would be useful is to put these policies in a bit of in real life context. So recently we've been working with Balfron Community Council, and within their local place plan, they've got a couple of different proposals which are in relation to climate mitigation and adaptation. So first of all, they've got one around community renewables project. So that's an aspiration or a vision to explore the development of a community-owned and shared ownership renewables project within the community council boundary. So that's not necessarily something they currently have, but is something that they're looking to do. So again, that links nicely into this National Planning Framework for Policy 2 by showing it's trying to have that ambition to kind of cut emissions. On the other hand, we've also got flood resilient measures for the Endrick water. So this was highlighted as an area of potential vulnerability for flood risk. So again, the vision for this is to design and implement future-proof flood resilience measures along the water course of the Endrick water. And this, on the other hand, is to do with climate change adaptation. So recognising the future impacts that may happen, how can we actually help our communities become more resilient and ready? Another example of how this could be applied in a local place plan context, Calendar has a local place plan, albeit it kind of came out ahead of NPF4 being formally published. But in light of that, if you were to retrospectively look at how you could help justify this particular example that I pulled out here, so where there is a sort of one on the screen there called Calendar Meadows. This was a proposal for a Meadows master plan. And the reason I popped this in here is it's a bit of both. So it's climate mitigation and adaptation. So it's mitigation in the sense that it refers to reducing car travel and trying to encourage active travel. And it's looking on the adaptation side at thinking about natural flood mitigation measures. So that just kind of shows you, there's lots of kind of different examples that relate to kind of climate due to its kind of cross-cutting nature, whether that be to do with renewables, whether that be to do with flood resilience, or a lot of the other kind of options that I kind of listed there. Another topic we thought would be helpful to have a bit of a deep dive around was kind of depopulation. But we're going to expand that out to a slightly kind of broader discussion point in this next theme. So I'm sure this may be an issue for many of you on the call here, just trying to think about how we can address depopulation. And actually, just yesterday, the SRUC published a new report on demographic change and outmigration in the rural and island Scotland. So I popped a link in the slides there that will be circulated around afterwards. And I recommend just having a little bit of a look at that, because that's a kind of helpful live data set in terms of covering the latest on this. And the map extract on the right hand side here is from that report. But in relation to issues around depopulation and rural development, some of the other things or discussion points, I guess, that are cropping up in relation to local place plans that we've had in terms of community discussions has been competition for future land use. And again, just chatting or thinking about the kind of introductions that were had in the call, that might be a bit of a live issue for some of you. Also, proposals around community-led tourism. So thinking about how we might attract more people to be able to live and work there. And also this links to rural homes, be that living and working, and also linking to discussions with landowners or local enterprises and retail as well. So it's thinking about not just this issue in isolation, but how, again, in a similar vein to climate, it cross-cuts a lot of the topics. So renewable energy is going to be one of those. Digital will be another in terms of digital infrastructure and connectivity, but also challenges around transport. Within the National Planning Framework 4, there's also some helpful kind of cross-cutting outcomes. And one of the ones we wanted to reflect on tonight with the focus on rural and islands was around rural revitalisation. So within that is the kind of aspiration to encourage sustainable development in rural areas, recognising the need to grow and support urban and rural communities together. And on the right-hand side here is an extract from that policy, which I'm sure you'll all be glad to know. I'm not going to read this out, but as you can see, highlighted in blue with the sort of underline is a range of kind of key policies, which essentially this cross-cuts. And that's everything from policy 17, which is around kind of rural homes, which we're going to talk about shortly. Policy 29, which is about rural development, which we're just about to kind of talk about in a bit more detail, right through to things on tourism, transport, local living, retail, all sorts. So that's worth having a little look at as well, because that as an overall kind of policy outcome can again be really useful for justifying your proposals. The other thing just to reflect on in this particular slide is the definition of remote rural. So it refers to, many of the policies kind of refer to remote rural, so I thought it would be helpful just to clarify what that means. And that is with reference to Scottish Government's sixfold urban rural classification, and it defines it as areas with a population of less than 3,000 people and with a drive time of over 30 minutes to a settlement of 10,000 people or more. So it's useful when you're kind of thinking about some of the more specific rural policies, just to look at kind of some of the wording and definitions around some of that. So what does Policy 29 Rural Development say? So the policy intent is to encourage rural economic activity, innovation and diversification while ensuring that a distinctive character of the rural area and the service function of small towns, natural assets and cultural heritage are safeguarded and enhanced. And really the kind of the policy outcomes again are about the balance and sustainable rural population. So coming back to the kind of original topic discussion theme around depopulation, this is a specific policy to try and help address some of that. So when we look at a bit of the policy extract, and I've just tried to pull out some kind of key points within that, but I would refer you to page 86 where you can see the full policy. Development proposals in remote rural areas where new development can often help sustain fragile communities will be supported. where the proposal will support local employment, supports and sustains existing communities, for example, through provision of digital infrastructure, and is also suitable in terms of location, access, siting, design, and environmental impact. So yeah, a couple of things within this is just that link, I guess, to thinking about how this policy could help you justify maybe some of the emerging proposals that might come through your plan from a rural development point of view, thinking about how do you tackle that kind of depopulation, thinking about how we get more people to be able to live and work locally, and also thinking about that link to employment as well, I think is quite helpful. But as you're possibly beginning to see, a lot of these policies are interconnected and have various links. So just as an example of what this might look like in a local place plan, Kingsbarns over in the East Neuk of Fife had this kind of policy as part of their justification for some of their proposals around amenities. So locally in their place, they recognised that there was a need for a village shop, somewhere residents could meet informally and socially. And that this need could be met through the inn at Kingsbarns, which could become a bit of a sort of multifunctional community hub, housing a shop, a kind of cafe and bar. And essentially what they were kind of arguing or justifying was that this is part of their rural revitalisation strategy, and that they wanted the inn to remain as that kind of like public building, as opposed to having a change of use to residential or another business use. And so they actually, in the kind of lower box there on the screen, they pulled out that specific rural revitalisation policy, which was the big kind of complicated one with all of the different policy links. But really what they were saying is, you know, the previous survey that they had carried out on housing for key workers showed that they needed to have more kind of new rural industry, and also having that link between housing and also new amenities as well. So I think it's kind of useful to begin to think about proposals together and not just in isolation. And the other example we just wanted to show was in Morven.
Chiara?
Paul, great. Do you want to jump in?
I'm here.
Great.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. So this example was from Morven, where I worked a couple of years ago. And here we have Knock Park development. So what happened here was that the community in Morven were able to secure money from the Scottish Land Fund to buy an area of grounds to the north of their village, which was probably, I think, 7 to 8 acres. So it's quite a large area of grounds. Morven, by the way, is just north of Mull. If you're coming up from Mull, you can get the ferry across to Loch Allen from Fishnish, and Loch Allen is the settlement just at the bottom of this map. So Knock Park's quite a large area, and they knew that they had some significant plans for developing that site. Not only did they want to create a motorhome area and a leisure and catering facility, they were looking to, and still are, it's a longer term project, but they want to create workshop units and self-storage units. And then across the site, they also wanted to make sure that there was going to be in the future an amphitheatre for events. So Knock Park is currently the place where they have the annual Morven Highland Games. And they also wanted to expand and consolidate the football pitch to support the wider community. They also identified part of the site as a nature reserve and were able to conceptualize a circular path going around that. And they also knew that they were going to need to have a couple of new access points come in. So you can see this is quite an advanced mini master plan for the site. These are ideas that they had been planning for quite a long time. The reason why they had particularly focused initially, at least in the first phase, on the motorhome area and the workshop units was because they'd identified these as projects that could generate income for the actual organisation, the charity that they were using, the vehicle to actually do all this development. And that could generate income to enable that to happen. So it's an enabling income from a couple of particular developments that were also going to benefit the community by diverting leisure homes away from where they were trying to park, that was causing a problem further into the village, but also supplying what they knew was a strong felt need around workshop units and self-storage units for the community. And their plan overall is to start at that point and then gradually expand and change the site. So the reason why this is I think such a powerful example is because I would hope it inspires you, actually. Many of you, several of you may already have a vision like this for a larger area of land that you'd hope to get a hold of through the Scottish Land Fund. It's important to note that using these plans can be a really powerful way to actually secure funding from key funders. So it's really powerful to have a community-wide consulted on document that you can have to submit for funding applications. And the committee around Knock Park decided to use this opportunity to lay out their plan, make sure that the community understood and could comment on it, and then secure, using the policies that Chiara have just been mentioning to justify their proposals, secure the possibility that this actual site would be accepted into the local development plan for Highland, which is currently being produced, which would enable them to get in principle development for this and de-risk some of the work that they were doing. So if you need to, grab a hold of the Morven Local Place Plan, and that you can use that as something helpful to inspire your own plans. Thanks, Chiara. So the next topic we want to look at is housing. Now, I know that this is going to have been almost certainly already mentioned earlier tonight. It's a big issue for communities across Scotland, wherever people are. But in rural and island areas, clearly it's almost existential for many communities, linking back to the depopulation theme that we've had previously. Often the key to understanding how a community can feel like it might thrive into the future and even reverse depopulation trends, the key that's been identified would be housing, particularly to particular types of housing that would attract younger people and enable younger people to come back to the community or stay in the community, or older folks to downsize, which would release other homes. And of course, there's connections to the possible questions of over-tourism or the impact of short-term lets, reducing the actual stock that's available. That's certainly the case up in the Highlands. Elsewhere in communities in the Central Belt, smaller villages that are maybe in rural areas, another key issue is just about a sense of pressure to need to absorb new houses when there's a desire to retain a sense of rural and village identity. So we're going to touch on both of these issues in the next few slides. Having said that, we need to. Oh, sorry, Chiara, back one. Having said that, we just need to accept that there is a housing crisis. So I'm thinking here particularly in some rural communities that would prefer to keep their own identities. There's different ways of doing that, but it's just important to acknowledge that there is a declared national housing emergency, and that Shelter themselves have pointed out that there are many, many, many private renters that are facing increasingly unaffordable rents and conditions. So I think it's necessary to balance our concerns, maybe if we were more in the Central Belt, around housing and the dangers of coalescence and that our communities might somehow merge together, or the loss of identity, with just the realization, the reality that there is a need to provide housing. So in your LPPs, it could well be that you want to take a position that resists or argues that less housing is preferable for your community. But we would want to encourage you to consider taking the opportunity to also take a position, should that not work out for you, a fallback position, where you indicate that should the council nevertheless be minded to allow housing to come, that you put a proposal in that lays out what housing would be acceptable to you in terms of the design, the massing, the number of stories, but also the sizes, the and the quality and the materials. So it's okay to take a firm position on preventing coalescence between villages or protecting the rural area or protecting the green belt. But we would advise you also to put forward a proposal that in the eventuality that something else, that housing does come forward and that you aren't able to prevent that happening. Keeps you on the front foot in that regard. Thanks, Kiara. So for rural homes, there's a specific policy. So there's a policy just for homes in general, which covers a lot of the core criteria and planning terms about what's expected from applications and what's expected to be put in the local development plan. But there's a particular policy, Policy 17, around rural homes. And what's noticeable here, particularly for me as a planner, compared to the previous national plan, is that for rural areas and remote rural areas, the criteria against which applications are assessed have been loosened, meaning that it has become, in planning terms, more easy in rural and remote rural areas. And Kiara's already mentioned the sixfold rural urban classification 2020. You might want to just double check, Google that, double check the different classifications. But it's actually become easier to justify and argue for the location of housing in rural and remote rural areas. So in rural areas, development proposals for new homes need to consider how the development will contribute to local living and take into account identified local housing needs, including affordable housing, as well as economic considerations and the transport needs of development that's appropriate for the rural location. So planners will have to use this criteria in remote rural areas to, sorry, my light's gone. In remote rural areas there's a hook here. So if you can demonstrate that that housing will contribute towards local living and take into account identified local housing needs, so if you've had a chance, perhaps with some support to secure a report that shows what your local housing needs are, and then you can use that to justify putting forward proposals for housing in your community. And then similarly, in remote rural areas, it will be acceptable to put forward housing on the basis that it supports and sustains an existing fragile community and supports identified local housing outcomes. So again, if you can prepare evidence as best you can and even put it into the local development, local place plan that you're preparing, those hooks are really quite powerful for beginning to open up planners to going, yeah, in principle, we begin to look at that as all else being appropriate. So it's just a little bit of good news that NPF4 is a bit more flexible in that regard. And so we come to a couple of examples. For this is an example, I'm aware that someone from Muckett may actually be here. So we've been working in Muckett over the last wee while. Muckett is near Dollar. It's a rural community in Clackmannanshire between Dollar and Kinross. It's a relatively small village. It's recently seen a significant housing development of 50 homes just on the edge, which the council officers refused initially, but then the reporter allowed. That was quite disappointing to local people because it was felt with their design of 2 stories and the number of houses that it was really impactful on the rural nature and identity of the village. So recognizing that's already been and gone. But recognizing that over the next 10 years, it could be the case that housing developers might try and apply to the council to bring forward more housing, the community decided to try and write as clear a policy proposal as they could that would indicate what they would find acceptable. In particular, they wanted to take a position to prevent the 2 small villages of Muckett, that's Poole of Muckett and Yetts of Muckett, to prevent the chance that there would be any housing that could merge the 2 villages together. So you see here in yellow, prevent coalescence. That's the fancy word for preventing 2 communities from coming together because of housing between Yetts of Muckett and Poole of Muckett. That's a very legitimate planning position to take. And so they reinforced that. But then they said that should other homes come forward, we would welcome between homes that would be between 1 and 3 bedrooms but of a lower density and larger plots than the ones that had just been approved. And in the further justification sections, we made it clear that we were quite disappointed with the ultimate approval of the reporter around the design of houses that were put in. And we showed that in the local development plan, the existing local development plan, that really shouldn't have happened. And we basically said, look, we particularly want to stress that just because these houses were allowed, that doesn't mean that that was right. And in the future, we really do want you to be careful about the massing and the sizes and choose houses that are particularly appropriate for the rural area. So that's Mucket. You can download that plan as well. Here's another one. So housing in more remote or highland areas, coming back to Mucket, sometimes we just have to come up with really creative strategies to see how we can meet housing need. Now, here is a proposal that was coming forward also in Morven that a community group would take on land ownership through the Scottish Land Fund, buying from the Forestry Commission a large area of woodlands that they would then use for a number of different elements, but part of that would be to create woodland crofts. Now, there are only a certain number of crofting counties. They're all in the north of Scotland. Crofting is particularly highly regulated. Crofting requires you, if you own a croft, to live on the croft or live within 20 miles of it. So here is a situation where the community in Morven decided, look, we've got a problem. We've got a housing shortage. Our housing is often being bought up from the outside, which is driving up prices. Sometimes it's being used for short-term lets, and what it's doing is it's pricing local people out of the market. Their local ferry master, who you can appreciate is a really important person, they couldn't even find a house. So what they said was, maybe there's another way we can do this. How about we create woodland crofts, and this is happening in different communities across Scotland, which would enable residential development within that croft. It would tie the person owning that to the land through the crofting legislation. It would enable people to live and work in Morven. And then if they moved on, then that croft would, because of the legislation, have to be filled by someone local. So that's an example of a really creative approach that's being attempted in Morven and in other communities across Scotland. I think there's one more, isn't there, Ciara? Yeah, so here's another one. So North Berwick, you wouldn't necessarily think North Berwick's particularly rural. I'm aware that maybe folks from Dunpender are here or elsewhere in East Lothian. So you'll be aware of this local place plan coming forward, but in particular, the housing pressures in North Berwick are such that the community wanted to put forward that the entire settlement boundary, within that settlement boundary, would become what's known as a short-term let control area, which is a new piece of planning legislation that would mean that any attempt within that area, should that proposal be accepted in the local development plan, any attempt to effectively use any existing primary house or dwelling house as a short-term let would require planning consent. That wouldn't mean that it wouldn't get necessarily planning consent, but it would mean that the local authority would have control over that change of use application and potentially refuse it. And so they decided to put that forward. There's, I think, Strathspey and Badenoch in Highland has already been designated as short-term let control area, and the whole of Edinburgh. There's quite a high bar to be able to establish that, but it had already become really clear that in particular in East Lothian, that was, in North Berwick, that was going to be a policy that could be adopted. So they also commissioned an additional piece of information, a report, where they had an economist show that it's as valuable for a property to be a primary dwelling as it is a tourism let. That's to help justify the idea that that might be a short-term let. Okay, I will stop there. So lastly, we come to coasts. Now, obviously, Scotland is dominated by coasts, many of our rural communities. And if you're here from an island, clearly you're surrounded by coasts. You may want to try and say something in your local place plan about your waters around your islands or off your coast. You may want to even talk about development that's happening further afield offshore. There's an interesting question here that I need to sort of just fill you in a little bit about. So my basic position is that I think it's very appropriate for you to put proposals about different types of development that might happen on your coasts or further out to sea into your local place plan. However, strictly speaking, local place plans form part of a particular type of planning legislation, the 2019 Planning Act. And the Town and Country Planning Acts, of which the 2019 Act is one, only covers the control that a local authority might have. And the local authority control of development ends at the level of mean high water springs. So it actually ends along the coast and doesn't include anything further. So strictly speaking, a local place plan that's trying to influence the local development plan would not normally be able to say anything about anything lower in nautical terms and tidal terms than mean high water springs. However, and that's because everything offshore from that point is actually controlled by the National Marine Plan, and they're currently creating National Marine Plan 2 at the moment. However, you can read through some of these slides later. My particular position is that any particular council is a statutory consultee for the National Marine Plan and should therefore be connecting all of the information that it gets through local place plans to influence local development, should be passing that on to Marine Scotland as a statutory consultee and sharing all of that information. And the councils and Marine Scotland should be working closely together. So my position basically is that you should, if you want to talk about perhaps establishing a marine protection area, or talk about aquaculture developments offshore, or developments that might have an offshore component like a wind farm, but then also an onshore component like storage, that you should talk about that. And I'd encourage you to put that into your local place plan. But just acknowledge that you recognise that some of these issues are covered by the National Marine Plan and encourage your local authority to pass that information on to Marine Scotland. And I would go further as to say you might just want to submit your local place plan directly to Marine Scotland if it contains anything to do with development at sea or off your coastal waters. Often the intertidal area, so between mean high and mean low water springs, is a bit of a Cinderella that doesn't get covered by stuff. People often want to say something about protecting that. So lay it all out. And if you want to talk about marine protection areas to control some of the stuff that might go on, then you would want to look into some of the different types that you could suggest might be appropriate, whether that's for bird species, that's SPAs, habitats generally, that's SACs or areas of special conservation, marine conservation zones, sites of special scientific interest, or Ramsar sites, which are to do with wetlands. You might want to come back to me on some of those, on any of that with questions. But it's just to say it's a little bit of a slightly odd connection between onshore planning legislation, a Marine Act, and what you might want to say in the local place plan. But I would encourage you still to put stuff in, submit to your local authority and to Marine Scotland. And within NPF4, there is actually quite a lot of direction and criteria for what is acceptable in aquaculture developments onshore in particular, because they're going to become more popular. They're a bit more easy to control in terms of their environmental impact. So there is some criteria that you might want to re-emphasize in your local place plans about what you would expect should any aquaculture development come forward in your area. Thanks, Ciara. Yeah, so there's a couple of examples. I probably won't go into them just now, but we've popped them into the slides. So one is about in Morven, it was put forward that they would try and create a marine management plan for Loch Allen. And they also wanted to designate the intertidal area as a nature network. So they've put that into their plan as a vision for what they'd like to see happen. And then I think there might be one more, Ciara. Yeah, so along the roads, here's an example of, it's a little bit more straightforward, but in Morven, they wanted to make sure that there was the option to expand their marina that they created 15 years ago. So they had a set of outline proposals as to the kind of things that they would like to see come forward in that development. Good. Back to you, Chiara.
Great, thank you, and thank you all for hopefully bearing with us. I know that's a huge amount of information to try and take in, but we thought it was helpful just to try and provide a bit of context around several themes which I'm sure are kind of close to maybe some of the kind of things you might have to think about or questions you might indeed have.